All right, everyone. I want to thank everyone for showing up for the Farsight Spotlight when we come to you once a week, Sunday evening, Eastern U.S. time, at around 7 o'clock to give you the latest and the greatest. So this is really big and really important and really interesting. You guys are going to love this. So I want to take a moment to explain what happened with my last spotlight, which was really interesting, and where I was talking about the high probability of a major terrorist disruptions in the United States, starting around Inauguration Day of the 20th of January. Now, I gave this discussion for important strategic reasons. You have to understand what those reasons are. And I consider the reasons absolutely solid. Moreover, I consider the outcome of the discussion very successful. So let me explain, because a lot of you are probably saying, what? The disruptions never happened. So I have to explain how this works and why I did it exactly the way I did it. Now, let me tell you that one of the primary goals of these spotlight conversations are to walk people through the thinking process of how to connect the remote viewing information to normal intelligence data. That's it. So we do the remote viewing side, but intelligence agencies do the normal intelligence gathering stuff. So I do not present any new remote viewing data in these spotlights. Those are done in our projects that you can see on FarsightPrime.com, as well as on our Deep News program and our Deep News show that we put on both YouTube and FarsightPrime.com. So in these spotlights, I envision how an intelligence agency would consider remote viewing data in combination with their own data. Okay, now by the end of this talk, I am going to offer what I consider the definition of proof with respect to what I say about the extraterrestrials, as well as the terrorist events and things like that, and that stuff, and especially about the stuff about the extraterrestrials, that there are, for example, that there are two sides, the so-called good ETs and the bad ETs, and that there is a soft war going on now. Well, the soft war, of course, is the psyops that are going on, and things are going to break out into the open in a really major way very soon. And Farsight is going to be clearly aligned with a very identifiable group of extraterrestrials who we call the good ETs. Now, some in our audience thought that my last spotlight established me as a supporter of Donald Trump, or a MAGA supporter. So it's important to emphasize that I am neither conservative nor liberal, and not Democratic or Republican. My only goal is disclosure, and that is the end of all secrecy, so as to free people on this planet to be able to make free decisions regarding their own future. That is the reason we use remote viewing to investigate so many projects here at Farsight. That is the Farsight mission. Now, we at Farsight, however, we do support the efforts of the government of the United States to keep this society together. If we're going to get into the future and be successful as a planet and everything else, we've got to keep some things together. We've got to get rid of the bad, but we've got to keep things together. So to this end, we often do projects where we target future potentially violent events, including future assassination attempts, in order to alert the authorities, which of course is the intelligence agency, of the upcoming attack, so that the security services in the United States can act to stop the attacks from happening. And we often do this in our Deep News projects. We do not consider who is president at the time, and we do not consider the person's politics. We don't consider which party is in power. We just think that part of our job, is to support whatever the mission is for the U.S. government, to encourage it for, surviving. And then also we want to encourage it with regard to disclosure. So if we help the government with regard to preventing major terrorist attacks, that is us making a contribution to the government. And then they know our agenda as well, which is disclosure. So if you help me, I help you, that type of thing. So in my last spotlight, I highlighted the high probability that some terrorist attacks and assassination attempts could, of course, occur on January 20th or soon after, and that could trigger larger conflicts. Now, I did this to ensure that the U.S. intelligence agencies connected the dots between our published remote viewing data and their own information collected through normal means. Now, they probably did this anyway, but I wanted to make sure, given the gravity of what we were seeing, I wanted to make sure that they didn't miss it. So it was my way of sending up a red flare, hoping that this would ensure that somebody noticed and that many would act on this information to prevent the attacks. Now, January 20th was uneventful in that respect. There were no major attacks in the domestic United States on that day or during the following week. That was the goal. I personally consider the effort made in the last spotlight to have been successful in that regard. Now, of course, the intelligence agencies do not communicate with us, nor do they give us feedback regarding the usefulness of our data. But we do know for certain that they look at everything that we do. And we are sufficiently confident in our capabilities at Farsight to know that what we do is real. And if a future event is perceived and it does not happen, then it is likely that our information was used to prevent the event from happening. That's our perspective. We cannot prove what I just told you without having members of the intelligence community publicly state that what they did with our data. And obviously, they're not going to do that. But we know that the agencies do consider our efforts sufficiently valuable as to keep a close tab on what we actually publish. So, remote viewing data has to be evaluated in combination with the normal intelligence information. So, I want to give you a window into the intelligence operations that go on that reflect on what we were doing. There are two recent analyses that are available on YouTube that you can see that seem to indicate a cross-link between Farsight data on domestic U.S. threats and Al-Qaeda, for example. Now, that's not the only threats that exist, but there's two really good sources of information where you can see a discussion regarding Al-Qaeda. Now, this was enough for us to want to send up that flare regarding potential threats starting on Inauguration Day on the 20th of January 2025. Now, it's important to know that Al-Qaeda likes to stage major terrorist attacks on notable days. The calendar is really important for Al-Qaeda. They have special days that they really highlight, and that's what they like to do. This is a very well-known characteristic of Al-Qaeda attacks. Now, let me talk about the two podcasts, or the two interviews, the two shows that you can watch that give you an idea, a really clear idea of the intelligence side of the story, and then you can sort of blend our remote viewing side and on the story with it. The first is a lady who's known as Jane Doe. That's not her real name, of course, and you couldn't actually see her face, but she's an intelligence asset for the U.S. government, and she was a very important asset. She's probably the leading person in terms of the information regarding Al-Qaeda. Now, she was on the Sean Ryan podcast on YouTube, and Sean Ryan, which is S-H-A-W-N, and then Ryan, R-Y-A-N, he numbers his podcast. So she was on number 159, and that was on the 15th of January in 2025. And she was describing how Al-Qaeda, and they monitor this a lot, is current plans are with respect to mass casualties. So it's not like a targeted event like one plane or something like that. Their current plan is, their orientation right now is on the concept of mass casualties. And we're talking about capabilities that include things like invisible bombs that are not easy to detect, and importantly, biological weapons. Okay. Now, the other podcast was 149, and that was Sarah Adams. Sarah Adams, she did an interview with Sean Ryan. Sean Ryan show number 149. So it's 159 and 149. So Sarah Adams is on 149, and that happened on December 12th, 2024. Now, she focuses on terrorist organizations such as Al-Qaeda and ISIS, with an emphasis again on Al-Qaeda. Now, the basic claims are that Al-Qaeda has trained, and get this, and deployed, okay, not just trained, but and deployed 1,000 terrorists in the domestic United States. Now, they have also trained people for Europe, and they trained people for other places, but just for the United States alone, trained and deployed 1,000 terrorists, and they are apparently here now and waiting. Their short-term goal seems to be to blend in so as to not be targets of interest from the authorities, but there are various strategies, but all for coordinated attacks. Al-Qaeda very typically uses coordinated attacks where lots of things happen at the same time. So this establishes the current capability of trained Al-Qaeda operatives to launch an attack. So they know that 1,000 terrorists have been deployed, trained and deployed in the United States. So they have capability. Now, the next thing you want to ask is, what about motive? The motive of Al-Qaeda has already been established. Now, this is just Al-Qaeda. There are other groups who also oppose the United States, but we're focusing now just on this one to give you an example of the type of things that happen. So one can safely assume that Al-Qaeda has, that these other groups rather have similar operations going on in terms of importing terrorist operatives into the United States, and that has to include the cartels, the drug cartels. That's actually a really big thing in some places, especially like in California, where the drug cartels work in farm areas to grow, to grow marijuana and other drugs, and they are extremely well supplied with effective weapons. And these cartels and these other groups, they have sufficient weapons to constitute a severe threat to the U.S. government interests. So remember that remote viewing is very, very different when you think about the future versus the past. And this is a consequence of the physics of remote viewing, the remote viewing process, and that's something that I've written about a lot in my book, for example, Remote Viewing, the Science and Theory of Non-Physical Perception, but also in the article, Remote Viewing, the Future with a tasking temporal outbounder. And that was published in the Journal of Scientific Exploration, and a copy of which can be found at the bottom of our homepage on our Institute's website, FARSIGHT.org. Now, let's talk about proof. This is important. You got to get this. There is no such thing as absolute proof for anything. The idea of proof is not the same for everyone. You have to understand how intelligence agencies think of the concept of proof. And basically, that's to recognize that the popular idea of proof that is held by most people, that it's something solid, is very different from the operational idea of proof. And intelligence agencies use the operational idea of proof, not the romanticized idea of proof that is common to most people. At least that's my view of how intelligence agencies work in most instances. Now, intelligence agencies, the idea of proof is similar to the way it's used in court cases. In court cases, courts find people guilty or innocent, and they claim that proof is determined by the process of evaluating available data. And the people are sentenced as a consequence of determining proof of guilt. But the available data are often very wrong. Courts are notoriously error-prone, and huge numbers of people have been committed to prison and even executed on inaccurate or even fabricated evidence. This is often shown by the number of inmates on death row, for example, who have been found innocent when the authorities, often very reluctantly and only under very serious pressure, examine DNA evidence that establishes that the convicted person was not guilty of the crime, and in fact, somebody else committed the crime. These cases are not rare, and a great many people have been executed before the DNA evidence was even examined, and when this happens, all further evidence to force the authorities to examine the DNA evidence is dropped. So we don't know how deep this goes. Now, police and the criminal justice system participants, all of them, they're trying to do their jobs well. But they are normal human beings with normal prejudices and biases. So proof is not certain even when authorities claim that they have proof. Everyone's idea of proof is different. Now, scientists, for example, let's go to the scientists. They often claim that they have proof of something, when in fact they are just talking about their own beliefs. I mean, how often do you see scientists get on shows on YouTube and media and say, we have no proof of UFOs being real or extraterrestrials being real? They're flying all over the place. They're being recorded all over the place. You have, shows like Ross Coulthard on News Nation. News Nation, of course, is easily seen on YouTube. Showing one whistleblower after the next. They've had congressional hearings, and these scientists are just saying we have no proof of anything. Okay. But they often claim that they have proof of something when in fact they're just talking about their own beliefs. For example, 1995 was a biggie. There was a widespread, meaning almost everybody, scientific belief that there were no planets around any other stars, not just in the galaxy, but on the entire universe. This is the true thing. In university courses, in physics and astronomy throughout the entire country of the United States and all over the world, physicists and astronomers were basically saying the way that a planet forms out of the primordial solar nebula of all the dust is so rare and so unusual, the likelihood of there being any planets around any stars is extremely small. So, now you laugh at it, but that's what they were teaching in the university courses, the best universities in the world. And now, of course, they discover planets, 2 or 3 planets a week around stars. But until 1995, that's what they were taught. Now, in 1995, somebody discovered the first physical evidence of a planet orbiting another star. And that's when it changed, okay? But they were offering their theory about the primordial solar nebula and the idea of dust coagulating into planets as proof. That's what they said was proof. Yet it was stupid, but that was their idea of proof, their theory. And then if they said, if you want to think there's a planet out there, you got to prove it. What are you supposed to do? But they had a solar system of one, which is a sample of one. And that solar system was our solar system. And that solar system had 9 major planets, an asteroid belt, comets, meteors, junk galore, all over the place, and they said there's no major planets around any other place. The only thing they could have said scientifically was the mean. They have to go back to statistics. Statistics are the basis of all science. And so they had to go back to that, and in the absence of other data, they could only say the mean. So the only thing they could have said from a scientific perspective is that there's an average of 9 major planets around every star. But, they didn't. They said no major planets around any stars. So you can see how everyone's idea of proof is quite different. So let's go back to the intelligence agencies. One can think of proof of a serious threat as the establishment of 2 criteria. Now, this is how the intelligence agencies think, at least in my view of describing how they think. The first thing they ask, the 2 criteria, the first thing they ask is it possible? Is there clear capability? So capability is the first thing. So if there is a potential threat, is it possible? Second thing, is there a motive or a desire to commit the offense? So if those 2 criteria, which is capability and a motive, are there, then, as far as the intelligence community is concerned, there is sufficient evidence to launch an intelligence counter-operation involving serious consequences, such as death. People can die once the intelligence operations go to start, stopping things. So, if the enemies can do it, and they have a desire to do it, then that is sufficient proof to say that they will do it in all probability. And the intelligence agencies then consider that sufficient to act to stop the serious threat from happening, even if lives are lost in the process. So the idea of proof is subjective. It's not concrete. So if the intelligence agencies see FARSIGHT data that suggests a major violent event, such as an assassination attempt, is in the future, they then have to ask themselves if the attack is possible. are there those who have the capability of conducting such an attack? So capability is first. So the first thing they do when they see Farsight's data is it possible? Are there people that have that capability? And then they ask if those same people have a motive or a desire to do it. So our Farsight data highlighting the potential of an attack in the near future, plus detailed descriptions of the attack, is enough in terms of proof to offer countermeasures if the potential attackers have the capability and the motive. So that's how it's all working with three things: the remote viewing data, and then evaluation of capability and motive. Again, if the remote viewers see it happening and the capability is established and the motives are clear, then that's all the proof that is necessary to locate the threat and to act to stop the attack. So our remote viewing data would have certainly been taken seriously by the intelligence services of the United States government, and them giving us feedback would not be necessary. Our data would have been taken seriously because of the stuff that you can see for yourself in the Sean Ryan podcast number 149 and number 159. So if the attacks do not happen, then we can assume that the intelligence and security services did their jobs well. End of story. Now, the intelligence agencies will not confirm this, of course, but we have to make the assumption that they acted to stop the attacks. So if you want to have remote viewing data always work, then you're talking about remote viewing the past or even the present. But if you're talking about the future and you're bringing that information back so that people can act on things, then the remote viewing data may not look like it works because people act to stop those things from happening. Again, remote viewing the future is different from remote viewing the past or present. When you remote view the future, you have the capability of changing the future by shifting timelines. And again, you can read more about this in my book and article that I talked about previously, the book Remote Viewing, the Science and Theory of Nonphysical Perception. So, I was confronted with the remote viewing data that clearly suggested domestic attacks in the United States. And if you watch those two podcasts on the Sean Ryan Show, you will see that the capability and motive exists as well. And so the only thing that I could do is to send up a red flare to make it super obvious that the intelligence agencies needed to consider this threat as imminent. So that is what I did with the last podcast. Now, again, if you want to see a good description of some of the science of what I'm talking about now, this is my book, Remote Viewing, the Science and Theory of Nonphysical Perception, and it's available on Kindle as well as paper and hardback. So if you want to sort of dive into all the physics, that's there. Now let's get to the extraterrestrial, the ET, or the UAP phenomenon. Now, it is really great that Ross Coulthart on News Nation, which you can see on YouTube, News Nation, one word, News Nation, on YouTube. Ross Coulthart is actually focusing so heavily on the topic of the UAPs and the or the UFOs, as the extraterrestrial or non-human intelligence type of thing. And Ross Coulthart himself not only was interviewing people, but he also has been interviewed by Don Trump Jr. That's right, the son of the president, who has his own podcast. That's interesting. I mean, the world is changing so radically. It was always in the old day, people that had any type of political thing were always trying to, show up on the news. Now, podcasts, mainstream news is dying, and podcasts and other types of diverse venues are really coming out. And Don Trump Jr. has a very popular podcast, which is interesting. He interviewed Ross Coulthart, so you could actually see Ross Coulthart bringing all these ideas up about the importance of disclosure and really pressing Don Trump Jr. to talk to his dad about these things. So information is getting to the higher circles. And there are also new whistleblowers coming out, seemingly weekly. Like in the last 2 weeks, has been like 4 or 5 new whistleblowers, which with personal hands-on stuff. So, but the conversation is still on the basic question of whether or not the extraterrestrial or non-human intelligence exists. Okay. That has to change at some point. When disclosure begins in earnest, then there's going to be a super rapid change of events. And people will then ask more about what the extraterrestrials have been doing all these years. So that's when it's going to really shift. And when that shift happens, it's going to be super fast. So then at that point, we will have established capability. Remember the proof? Intelligence community. So as soon as you say that the extraterrestrials exist, which is coming fast, then you've established capability. And the focus is then going to shift to motives. Remember capability and motives? I told you that was important with the intelligence services. It's also important here with the extraterrestrials. Once you establish that they exist, you have established capability. And then the next thing is, what do they want to do? What are they trying to do? And then the discussion is going to shift to the differences in motives that are held by different extraterrestrials. Now, the current focus is still on extraterrestrials as one group, not as a diverse collection of groups with different agendas. So that diversity is going to be the next focus of attention, and that is what Farsight is all about. So we have, of course, our streaming service, FarsightPrime.com. We also have our website, farsight.org, and we have our YouTube channel, Farsight, and we have our Farsight newsletter, which you can sign up for on our website, farsight.org. So we have those basic elements for reaching out to the public. So let's talk about Farsight Prime for a second. FarsightPrime.com has been designed from the beginning to give you the full dose of the complexity of the ET phenomenon. Now, many in the New Age community, I love them all, but many in the community, they focus on ETs, extraterrestrials, being all good, warm, fuzzy wuzzies. But that is so incredibly wrong. There are some instances where people being taken on events such as the so-called CE5 events, where you go out and you try to attract the ship and you see the lights and so on like that. Sometimes those people are required to sign agreements to only publicly discuss the ETs as all being positive, or not to mention the possibility that some of the ETs are bad. So this is crazy, folks. The only place you can get a full picture of how there are both good ETs and bad ETs is the library of FarsightPrime.com. You have to go to all throughout history, all the different things that happen. You have to be able to go throughout the whole thing and then look at the methodology. But right now we have a soft war. And so in places and people that seem very innocent, they're involved even unknowingly in psyops. Disinformation psyops. Now remember, truth is also a psyop. That's what we do at Farsight. Truth is a very, very powerful psyop. You're trying to influence the way people think, and you have to convince them that the truth is logical and it makes sense, and that they should, think of it more closely as being something that's real. But disinformation, which is non-truth, those psyops are everywhere, and we can only trust the information that we collect ourselves because of these disinformation psyops. We have to be absolutely certain that the remote viewing information are all collected under totally blind, scientifically defensible conditions. So even if someone says they did remote viewing, they can't just say that. They have to say how it was done, under what conditions. Was it blind? Was it totally blind? And can we see? Was it video recorded? Can we see how it was done? So these are very important criteria when you're looking at the evidence that we want to consider that there are both good ETs and bad ETs. When we're looking not just at the capability, remember the capability is just, do they exist? Once you say they exist, then you can say, okay, they have the capability of flying across interstellar space and getting to us, so it's real. then you have to ask the motive. All right? And that is when the complexity comes in. And that's when the whole house of cards that is sort of the New Age house of cards, that all the ETs are good and the only bad thing is humanity that can't take its head out of the sand and sort of acknowledge that the ETs are real, and as long as we look up, we're going to see a whole galaxy of life that is filled with people who are warm and trying to embrace us and so on. We're going to see that was just a psyops. That was a disinformation psyops, that it's very complex. And so that's what the Farsight Prime library is all about, farsightprime.com. So if you haven't actually signed up and looked through it, all those projects, we have over 100 major projects, and each one of them are done under totally blind, very scientifically defensible conditions. And we even show you how the targets are told to the remote viewers after they do all their work, totally solo and blind on video, whether you get to see the target reveal, and you can see how authentic it is. Wow, the remote viewer says, wow, that was, wow. You can see their response. That's what you have to do. You have to be able to not just say you did it, but you have to be able to show people that you did it. And it has to be in an interesting way, a cinematically interesting way, so people actually want to see it, and so on. We just did a project we just released on ET PSYOPs, so if you haven't seen that, that's the latest and the greatest. And the next one that's going to be coming out, actually in just a few days, is on TWA Flight 800, which was a flight that was knocked out of the sky, and the government said one set of things, and our remote viewing says something different happened on that one. So we're going to go that, and that'll be published in just a few days. So anyway, that was TWA Flight 800. But the ET PSYOPs is the latest and the greatest, and it is fascinating. No one's ever complained, to my knowledge, of our projects being too long. I mean, it's riveting. I mean, get out the popcorn and go through 2 or 3 hours of watching stuff, come through in your very eyes, and you can say, and it's so great because you get to see the remote viewers doing their stuff, and you know that they're totally blind, but you know what the target is, even though they don't know. And the basic thing is, even me, when I watch the stuff, remember their video recordings are done solo, so I don't see them till after they're totally recorded. I watch these things also, and I go, oh my gosh, look at that. So it's fun for me also to actually see this stuff. And again, we do also, if you haven't signed up for our YouTube channel, do that as well, because you get to see some of these. So you get the spotlights are there, as well as on farsightprime.com, but also we put out the deep news projects on Farsight, on the Farsight YouTube channel as well. So you want to be able to make sure you get all that. And remember our the email newsletter. That's the only way we notify people of these spotlights, for example, when you get to watch them live. Also, when you do subscribe to our YouTube channel, please remember to click on the notifications bell. That's the only way YouTube actually notifies you when things like this happen. I want to thank you so much for tuning in and for coming. And let me see, how long have we been going on? Okay, this is about 36 minutes, which is good. These spotlights typically go between 30 minutes and an hour. So that's what I wanted to do now. I wanted to deal with proof. The concept of proof, so you can understand how it's different for different people. All right, everybody, this is great. I want to thank you for showing up. We had a good turnout, and I will see you again next week, same place, next Sunday, and there we're going to be covering more of the latest and the greatest. See you then.